Good afternoon. I want to welcome everyone to the final event of Northern Illinois University's Open Access Week activities. Basically, at the heart of open access is the unrestricted sharing of research and new knowledge among all populations. But ironically, as technology and geographical barriers to information sharing have become to be eliminated over the past 20 years, the cost of subscriptions to scholarly journals has increased almost 400% during that same time period. Open access movement seeks to change the way scholarly research is distributed and made available while maintaining, and some would even argue, enhancing the critical peer review process. The movement actually has existed for a long time, but recent events have caused it to rapidly gain momentum. People are finally beginning to take notice. Faculty senates and institutions such as Harvard University, MIT, University of California System have recently passed policies in support of open access publishing. These were faculty generated. It came from the faculty. It wasn't an administrative mandate. And meanwhile, in February of 2013, the White House issued an executive order requiring that all federal agencies develop an open access policy. In August of this year, Governor Quinn signed into law the Open Access to Research Articles Act. This act requires every public university in the state of university to do three things. The first is to establish a task force to consider how it can best further open access. Second, review how peer institutions in the federal government are addressing issues related to open access, ensure that any institutional or statewide policies are consistent with steps taken by federal grant-making agencies. And third, consider academic, legal, ethical, and fiscal ramifications and questions regarding an open access policy. I hope I covered those correctly because I have the author of the bill here right beside me. This important piece of legislation has created an opportunity for shared discussion between institutions of higher education in Illinois and is driving the adoption of a movement that seeks to eliminate unnecessary barriers to dissemination of scholarship these institutions are engaged in. The Open Access to Research Articles Act is as timely as it is significant. It's therefore my pleasure to introduce to you the author of this act, State Senator Daniel Biss. Just do a quick bio on the senator. He grew up in Bloomington, Indiana, moved to Chicago after completing a Bachelor of Arts at Harvard University and a PhD in mathematics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. At the age of 25, he joined the faculty of the University of Chicago's mathematics department. He later served as an advisor to the Illinois governor on ethics and transparency. Senator Biss began his elected political career in 2011 as a member of the Illinois House of Representatives. In the following year, he was elected from the 9th District to the Illinois State Senate, assuming this office in January of 2013. Senator Biss is active in the Illinois State Senate's Licensed Activities and Pensions, Education, Higher Education, Environment, and Local Government Committees. As a published researcher and scholar, Senator Biss has brought to the Illinois State Senate a unique perspective on the advantages of open access to both the creators and consumers of knowledge, as well as those who fund the work being carried out by our researchers and scholars. Please do join me in welcoming Senator Daniel Biss.
Well, thank you very much for the generous introduction and the even more generous invitation to be with you this afternoon. First, just because I'm paranoid and a little bit crazy, can people hear me? Excellent. It really is an honor to be here, and I'm excited that the university is engaging in the activities that you're engaging in this week, and honored to be a part of it. As a personal note, I should say that my father grew up literally across the street on Lincoln Highway, and his father was a physician in town, had no direct connection with the university, but his mother was at various points in her life on the cello faculty here, and it's just a really meaningful thing for me to be back here. I appreciate it more than I can say. I'd like to begin with a story. Forgive me if it's a story you know. It's a good one. It's the story of the mathematician Srinivas Ramanujan, who was born in 1887 in a relatively lower middle class rural family in India, and exhibited from a very young age truly remarkable mathematical talent. At every stage of his schooling, he was unlike anyone his teachers and peers had ever seen. Went off to high school and was had a little trouble getting through it. Like so many people with remarkable abilities, found his intense passion for one subject to distract him from doing his homework in other subjects. And in 1903, at the age of 16, was at that point in a library and found a book called A Synopsis of Elementary Results in Pure and Applied Mathematics by George Carr, a fairly unknown book by a mediocre mathematician that happened to have made its way to a library he had access to in rural India, and he was entranced by it, entranced by the things that it said and the things that it didn't, and used it as a roadmap to teach himself mathematics. Wound up in a arranged marriage and having to now quit all schooling just to make some kind of living as a clerk for his young wife, but just couldn't get this mathematics out of his head, and filled notebook after notebook with mathematical concepts and formulas and equations that he had never seen anywhere else before, and started to view those notebooks as his calling card. Went about from wealthy person to influential person, trying to find a patron, if you will, who would take him in and support his intellectual endeavors, and finally began sending his works across the ocean to the world's most distinguished mathematicians, most of whom ignored him, assuming that it was just a crank or a fraud or who knows what. I will say, actually, that even in my much more modest station as a mathematician, I got a lot of correspondence from crazy people. So it's an understandable but very unfortunate mistake. And then one day in very late 1910, he sent his works to the English mathematician G.H. Hardy, who was probably the dominant figure in English mathematics at the time. And Hardy looked through these papers and saw that some were things that were known and some were things that he'd never heard of before and some were things that seemed kind of wrong, and couldn't help but conclude that if this was a hoax, it was a hell of a complicated hoax, and probably Occam's razor told him that it would actually have been simpler for this to just be some kind of genius or from across the world than for it to be this kind of elaborately constructed hoax. Shared it with his collaborator and colleague at Cambridge University, mathematician Littlewood. They determined that this was someone they had to support, paid for Ramanujan to come across the ocean and become a participant and then eventually a fellow of Trinity College at Cambridge, and where he arrived in 1914 only, and embarked on a really extraordinary mathematical set of studies, very, very intense collaboration with Hardy, who became not only a mentor but a collaborator and a colleague and friend. I'll remind you that he arrived in 1914, which is important to bear in mind when I tell you that he died in 1920, ending a really extraordinary and romantic and exotic and inspiring and exciting and challenging narrative in human intellectual history. There's a lot to say about Ramanujan, but I'm only going to say one more thing, which is that you might ask, what did this massively unconventional path into becoming a world-leading scholar, what did it do for his intellectual development? And to that I turn to Hardy, his discoverer, and then his teacher, his patron, and eventually his collaborator and colleague and friend. Hardy wrote a book called A Mathematician's Apology, and if you haven't read it, you shouldn't be here at all. You should be at home reading it. It's just, I mean, here it is. It's, I'll count for you. It's 151 pages long, and the foreword is like 60 pages, also worth reading, but you can skip it if you're in a hurry, really. Go home now. But I won't read you from the book. I'll read you from the foreword, which is by C.P. Snow, himself a distinguished scholar, author of the famous Two Cultures essay. He writes about exactly this question in the foreword to A Mathematician's Apology. He writes, even inside mathematics, this is on page 36 if you're really in a hurry, even inside mathematics they had to come to terms with a difference in their education, they meaning Hardy and Ramanujan. Ramanujan was self-taught, he knew nothing of the modern rigor, in a sense he didn't know what a proof was. In an uncharacteristically sloppy moment, Hardy once wrote that if he had been better educated, he would have been less Ramanujan. Coming back to his ironic senses, Hardy later corrected himself and said that the statement was nonsense. If Ramanujan had been better educated, he would have been even more wonderful than he was. Well, people could argue about this, but I think if you think it through carefully, it becomes hard to dispute that as romantic and powerful and extraordinary the narrative is, and it has a lot for all of us to learn from, it's hard to envision it being the optimal route to scholarship. And at the end of the day, as much as we may love to romanticize the lonely genius finding his way in the developing world, teachers are pretty important. Learning from established tracts of knowledge and thinking is pretty important. And immersing yourself, if you are to be one of the world's leaders in a highly difficult technical and abstruse discipline, immersing yourself in the cutting edge of modern day state-of-the-art thinking is a necessary step to achieving your potential. And Ramanujan didn't and couldn't because he was cut off from that state-of-the-art of human knowledge. He had no way to access the bulk of modern thinking. He became what he became by virtue of, at the age of 16, stumbling on a pretty ordinary book by a devoted teacher, but frankly not a leading doer in the field. Imagine what might have been had he instead had access to the true state of the art, had he been able to surround himself in that knowledge. We're here today and this week, and we're interested in this issue because that eventuality is today in 2013 avoidable. It's avoidable. It's avoidable because, to put it simply, of technology that means that nowhere on the globe need any lower middle class person be isolated from the modern state-of-the-art stream of knowledge, research, scholarship, human intellectual development, and argumentation. And that fundamental revolution in the technological ability to access information is what brings us to have this discussion about the appropriate regulatory, cultural, and economic framework to put in place to allow it to be. So what is open access about? Suppose I should maybe take a moment to tear down the fourth wall and acknowledge that my notes, I took note, I mean, I've got, like, there's a lot written down here. Don't think otherwise. But on this point, my notes say, sort of coquettishly, OA for open access is, and there's this ellipsis. So we'll have to wing it, I suppose. Open access is a movement. And it's a movement that's built around a very, very, very core principle, which is about the freedom of information. That information wants to be free. That information wants to make itself available to those who are interested. That information wants technology to be the utmost constraint on its transmission throughout the world and to people, and that information respects the technology, leaves constraints in place, and more on that later, but doesn't want humans to put additional artificial constraints beyond those that are simply inevitable physical consequence of what technology allows. I started with this example for two reasons. One, because it's a really beautiful story, and it's a powerful thing to think about. But also because I think it's important to think about this issue among other lenses through the lens of social justice and equality of opportunity. There's a lot of economics that comes into this issue, and we'll talk about that in a second. But at its heart, the issue of access to information is an issue of justice. Whether it's economic justice in the context of economic opportunity and academic opportunity to someone who might grow up in rural India at the beginning of the 20th century, or whether it's about political justice. We all know far too well, reading the history of the 20th century, about the consequences on political justice of the restriction of information. I'm sorry, did I say 20th century? I meant 20th century and beyond. And I think it's important to think for a moment about the consequence of decisions we make in this arena through the lens of their impact on all of society. So what do I mean by that? We've gotten to a place in 2013 where I think there's broad academic, there's a broad body of academic research regarding institutionalized sexism in the sciences. You've read about more and more research that's been done recently. There's a very, very highly publicized study about resumes being sent out to lab directors, and the only difference was the first name of the person whose application was purported to be sent. Was it Jane or John? And very, very significant consequences in how the lab director viewed the quality of the applicant. There's a growing body of evidence that there exists today, still in 2013, institutionalized sexism in the sciences. And we think about that usually from the point of view of justice for the individuals being discriminated against. As well we should, because of course it's very, very important. Rising in medical research or mathematics research is a wonderful joy. Following your curiosity and your passion is a privilege that should be extended to all, and frankly, it's a question of economic equality as well. These are professions that are remunerative and allow entry into the upper echelons of society, and it's a real justice problem if we systematically discriminate against half of our population vis-a-vis their entrance into those professions. But there's another also very important angle to think about, which is not the lens of the individual being discriminated against, it's the lens of the social benefit being foregone by a society that does not engage in its research in the optimal fashion. So in this particular example, the one of institutionalized sexism, you may notice that at a first order approximation, 50% of humans are women. I know that one could engage in second order approximations if one were so inclined, but let's leave that for another day. At a first order approximation, 50% of humans are women. And if you're prepared to assume with me, without some, but with me and I think with most, that this means that 50% of the people who have the potential to be the top medical, chemical, physical, and mathematical researchers in the world are women, and that we have erected institutional roadblocks that stop almost all of that 50% from winding up in that profession, we are foregoing a lot of really good medical, mathematical, chemical, physical research. We're impeding the product by creating roadblocks that it can only be concluded are making it difficult for those who are in a position to be great contributors to, in fact, contribute. And this, I think this is like really serious stuff. And if you're like me, someone who loves beautiful mathematics, and you just feel kind of sad about the fact that, you know, you're going to die before a certain beautiful piece of mathematics is invented because of these institutionalized roadblocks, that's you know, frustrating, but it's maybe not the end of the world. But when we're talking about things like medical research and technological development that allows for the betterment of society and the creation of economic growth, it becomes kind of problematic and a little bit crazy that we don't view the loss to society as enormously significant. I think that we need to acknowledge that a world where medical research had progressed far more quickly would be a world with less suffering and more longevity, and it seems like that's a thing to understand and acknowledge and probably lament. And so, to return to our topic, if we view open access as a conversation that is also, in addition to the other stuff it's about empowering those around the world, and not those, by the way, in true third world poverty, but billions and billions and billions and billions of people around the world to have access to state-of-the-art information, the most contemporary thinking on technical, difficult, sophisticated topics so as to enable them to achieve their full potential and then commensurately contribute to the progress of society, we might realize that by failing to move on this topic, we're actually holding ourselves back in a real, let's say, probably not measurable empirically, but significant respect. So that's why I wanted to start with that story. This is something that I think is about, in a very fundamental way, enabling lines of research and inquiry to develop not only in a fairer, more just, more open way, but ultimately a faster, more effective, and better for all of us way. But all of that aside, I think it's probably important to acknowledge this is a topic that is about other stuff too. So let's talk about some of the other stuff now. I think the time has come. Let us talk for a moment about the economics of academic publishing vis-a-vis specifically higher education in America. We will talk about that construed in that way for two reasons. One, because it applies to us here at Northern Illinois University, and two, because I don't know stuff about how higher ed works in the rest of the world. So this is what we're going to start with. So to review, the economics of academic publishing goes something like this. You, scholars, do research. Thank you. You do it because you love it. You do it because it's interesting. You do it maybe because its applications are important. But you also do it because it's a condition of employment. It's how you got your job, and it's how you get your promotions. Depending upon the arrangement on your particular campus, it's very likely how you get your raises, and so forth. And so you do it because you love it, and because you have to do it, and because it's your job, and therefore you certainly don't expect somebody to pay you for it. You just do it. You write your papers, you send them off to journals. Those journals are edited by editors. Those editors are most often also faculty members at academic institutions. The opportunity to edit the journal is a honor. It's a mark of professional prestige. It's also, of course, an opportunity to shape the profession and the field that you work in and love. And by the way, it's considered service, which is also, in one form or another, very frequently a condition of employment. So people do it without the expectation of all that much remuneration, and editors are certainly more often than not paid, but not necessarily in a manner that if you were to calculate both their hourly wage for doing it and their level of education would be viewed as particularly advantageous. So what do the editors do when they've been sent your research article? They send it to referees. Referees are also, more often than not, academics employed by universities. Refereeing a paper is something that is necessary to make the world of peer review and research go around, and it's also, let's remember, service, which is typically a condition of employment along with teaching and research. And so referees agree to do it. In my experience, they almost always agree to do it, and they again, expect no remuneration. Then the editor gets the referee report and thinks about it and weighs it against the other referee reports and decides what to publish, and then the stuff that happens, involving printing and copy editing and binding and mailing and posting online, spoiler alert, and stuff like that. But then, of course, they've got their product and they've got to sell it. And who do they sell it to? Well, they sell it to university libraries. And now is when there's a certain person from whose vantage point this might begin to seem like a frustrating situation. So we, the university, bless you, demanded that our faculty produce this research without remuneration as a condition of employment. Then they sent it to editors who oversaw the refereeing process with nominal remuneration, essentially as a condition of employment. The refereeing itself was done by other academics without remuneration, essentially as a condition of employment. And then the university has to buy the damn things from the publisher for the library so the same people who wrote them can read them. Again, I'm just a legislator, but I could imagine other people sitting in vantage points from which this would seem to be a frustrating situation. Of course, though, I'm not done. Frustrating you, that is. The journals are very, very extreme examples of what you might call reputationally branded commodities. The editors vary over time, the referees vary constantly, the authors vary constantly. Who's doing the publishing doesn't make much of a difference from the point of view of the marketplace. But the journal, whatever it is, whatever it means to be a journal, not in the technical or economic sense, but in the mind of the marketplace, the name of the journal, the reputation of the journal, the prestige that the journal confers by virtue of its history upon all those articles that are published in it, is an enormously meaningful and valuable brand. And that brand helps to establish professional careers in academia. It helps to distinguish between different research articles and different research products. And because those brands are more or less self-perpetuating, what you find is that the most elite of those brands have the enviable position of being a business whose product must be purchased. So you can't really be an academic library at a research institution and not subscribe to a certain list of journals. You can't possibly do it. the economists might call this inelastic demand. And that leads to a remarkable pricing power. It's inelastic demand for a commodity in which there's no competition. So I'll give you examples. The two most elite mathematics journals are the Annals of Mathematics and Invenciones Mathematicae. They're similar journals in that they both publish the best math papers ever, and if you want to stop listening to some politician prattle on about open access and instead see something really beautiful, you should get thee to the math library and just open it to a random page and from, say, the year 1963, and you'll have a wonderful afternoon. I mean, you know, depending on your tastes. I can tell you from experience that when you write an article of a caliber to be considered for those journals, you might think, well, this article, by virtue of the fact that it was inspired by a different article, might be better in this journal or that journal. But basically, they're very comparable in what they publish, but they're not competitors in the sense that one could put the other out of business. They're simply both journals that if you're a math department where people do research, you have to buy them, no matter what they cost. Well, the Annals of Mathematics is a nonprofit entity run by the Princeton University Press, and Invenciones Mathematicae is a for-profit journal. And what you find is that, you know, fractions are hard because they've got numerators and denominators. Is that not true? But by any metric you might care to produce, whether it's dollar per page or dollar per issue or dollar per article, the Annals of Mathematics costs, you know, not 20% less than Invenciones, but different order of magnitude. Because they both are products that are, for which the demand is inelastic, and the one whose price is determined by a for-profit entity they'd be engaging in corporate malpractice not to charge rates like that. So if someone at this institution publishes a paper in Invenciones Mathematicae, which is something they do as a condition of employment, it's something they're proud and pleased to have done without remuneration because it's a great mark of success in the career, then the institution has to go and spend tens of thousands of dollars to buy that journal back for the library so that their colleagues can read it. This is problematic. It's problematic because, I mean, if you were to be a populist about it, you would just say it's problematic because why are we letting this for-profit corporation take all this money? That just seems wrong. Whatever your sympathies with that argument, and I have to confess that mine are considerable, it's problematic for much more practical reasons. It's problematic because resources at universities are super constrained. It's problematic because the faculty are happy to publish there without remuneration as a condition of employment, but they wouldn't mind being paid a little bit more if their libraries didn't have to spend so much damn money on these subscriptions. It's problematic because while demand at research universities for the Annals of Mathematics and Invenciones Mathematicae may well be truly inelastic, life exists on the margins. And we see across academia libraries cutting back and cutting back. We see at many institutions, maybe not an institution as distinguished as Northern Illinois, but maybe, and certainly lots of institutions, we see very painful polls being done of faculty. We're going to have to cut 2 journals this year. Which ones are you reading the least frequently? Though at this point, the ones that we still have, you all read sometimes. So it's problematic for those reasons. And then, and wait, we are, for better or for worse, listening to some politician prattle on. So let me now return for a moment to the present day 2013 Daniels first person and say it's problematic from the point of view of the public sector as well. Why? Well, of course, it's kind of obvious that to the extent that public institutions of higher education are directly supported by the government, and to the extent that they're getting a bad deal out of the system, that is in turn indirectly a bad deal for the government and a deal that the government ought to do its best to delicately intervene to improve. But I guess I would point out that the discussion doesn't begin and end with direct, let's say, state support for, let's say, land grant or other public institutions. There are basically three sources of dollars for the higher education system. I'm simplifying and pruning, but there's three biggies. There's direct government support, which of course itself comes in a couple different categories. It comes in the category of direct old state appropriations for the university, because you're a state university, but also comes from all manner of federal research grants and even some other forms of federal support. Then there is tuition, and even if we want to put aside the fact that tuition seems high, and that highness pains all of us, and is a problem in society, a real problem. I'm not saying this like some jerk politician beating you guys up, because I understand that you're responding to reality and that we create part of reality. It's not your fault, but it's a bad situation when we talk about and these are all cliches, you know them, every politician says them all the time, but I can't stop myself. When we acknowledge the extraordinary and increasing importance of a strong post-secondary education for economic opportunity with this growth in costs, it's just a difficult and problematic situation for us to be undergoing as a society, and one that in and of itself bears some very, very, very serious thinking and re-envisioning and doing. But even beyond that, to speak in a more parochial way on behalf of the government's bottom line, in other words, not on the people's bottom line, but on the government's bottom line, when we remember that tuition is directly assisted in sort of modest levels by things like MAP grants on the state level and Pell grants, but also that there are tons and tons and tons of federal intervention in the student loan industry. This source of dollars for the higher ed sector, the tuition dollars, is in one way or another massively tied up with government resources, and then once again the government has a direct stake in the matter. And then of course the third place that the higher ed sector finds significant financial support from is just direct contributions. And what are they? Tax deductible. We think of that as private, but that's a lie. That form of tax deduction is a significant source of hidden public support. Maybe, I'm not saying it's good or bad, maybe it's inadequate, maybe there should be bigger tax advantage for contributions to higher ed, maybe there should be none at all, maybe we're doing it just right now, but I just want us to all acknowledge it's a significant source of hidden and often unacknowledged government support. And so when you unpeel Daniel. In a temple of higher education, I just said unpeel. You guys are very polite to remain seated. If when we peel this onion of higher ed finance in this way and really acknowledge the number of different points of contact with public sector budgets and the significant impact on public sector spending and public sector resources available for other higher education priorities or other non-higher education priorities, I think we begin to see that if we are prepared to agree that the current economics of academic publishing are placing a significant and unnecessary burden on university library budgets, that is a cause of legitimate concern and indeed participation for the government itself. So that is the conversation that we're seeking to have, a conversation about open access to research in a way that disseminates research openly throughout the globe to everyone who has an internet connection. Everyone has an internet connection so as to create a more just mechanism of transference of information, so as to create intellectual, academic, economic, and cultural opportunities across the globe for people to whom those opportunities used to be entirely, or at least largely unavailable, and to simultaneously, via a variety of economic nudges, and this is important, not economic revolutions, economic nudges, place some downward pressure on the price schemes of academic publishers so as to free up some of those resources that the library is currently using in a way that they therefore don't go to hiring more faculty or higher salary for faculty or lower teaching loads or buildings or tuition mitigation and so forth. That's what we're here for, and that's what we would like to accomplish. So I want to just briefly say a few things about kind of what our bill does and what it doesn't do, and what the open access movement necessarily means, what it may mean, what it need not mean, and what it doesn't mean. Our bill was Senate Bill 1900, signed into law this summer, and it was a product of my extremely strong interest in this topic and very deeply held view that it is to the benefit of society, but also very significantly to the benefit of our university communities to move toward open access. But it was also significantly affected, the bill was, by my recognition, a recognition that some people in this room helped me to arrive at. I think some would say belatedly helped me to arrive at, but nonetheless here we are, that this is not a decision that is best made away from the campus. There are today something close to 6 institutions of higher education in North America. Some were mentioned in the introduction, Harvard, MIT, the University of California system. Some are as geographically close to Illinois as Washington University in St. Louis and Purdue University in West Lafayette. But none of them are in the state of Illinois. These institutions all have adopted an open access policy on their campus of one form or another. They vary. In fact, they vary quite significantly. But their goal in each case is to move toward a posture where the faculty will all publish their research in open access journals, an open access journal being defined as the journal that makes its publications freely available online to the public. So there are different ways to, we'll get there in a second. So, what is the bill? The bill essentially lays out what the question is. It says, hey, we'd like to make information as widely available as possible. It goes on to say, hey, the public, or if you want to put it that way, the taxpayer has a direct interest in this question because we directly and indirectly play a role, perhaps an inadequate role, but a significant role nonetheless, in financing public institutions of higher education in Illinois. And therefore, in some sense, we're kind of partly, we like to think of ourselves at least taking some partial indirect credit for the scholarship and research that is done on these campuses, and therefore we would like the research to be as broadly available to our people as possible. The parochial interpretation of that sentence would be to the people of Illinois whose tax dollars fund the institutions, and that's of course in and of itself an important priority, but I think we might go beyond that and talk about the global public interest in having information globally accessible. So it lays out the questions, it talks about some of the tensions around How do you do this in a way that retains the academic freedom of the scholar to publish where they would like? It talks about the cost questions. What does open access mean? Do you publish in a journal who's responsible for making things available online, or do you on campus create a repository where things will be made available online here? If the latter, who's going to pay for it? Who maintains it? Who oversees it? And so forth. So it lays out these questions, and then it says something very far-reaching, very radical. It says that on each of our 9 campuses, at each of our 9 public universities, so I guess that means there are, help me here, 12 campuses. At each of our 9 universities, a task force shall be created. Task force shall have representatives from the faculty, from the administration, and from the library, and they'll talk this stuff through, and they'll figure out what to recommend. Now, I will tell you my bias. I hope they recommend that the universities adopt an open access policy. I won't say which one. That's not my job. It's quite possible, not at all certain, but it's quite possible that different open access policies will be right for different institutions. And certainly some might, probably will, say that we don't want to worry about this right now. But it's my hope that some of these task forces will say there is a way that is consistent with our institutional values, with the habits and practices of scholarship and publishing that exist on campus, to enact an open access policy, to move ourselves toward a place where we will be ensuring that scholarship which is done at our institution is publicly, universally available online. This is something which is doable and which has been done by many institutions, can be done in a radical way or can be done in a modest way, and different levels of intensity and different levels of universality will be appropriate for different institutions, but it's something that can be done and will over time play a role in facilitating that global dissemination of information which is so important for global economic justice, as well as the advancement of scholarship across the world, as well as that corrective in this market problem that is resulting in unnecessary costs to our libraries. People wonder a little bit, does this end peer review? Will this bankrupt the journals? Will this move us away from the context of publication that we know about and toward a world where I just have a blog and I will post whatever I do on my blog, and I hope you like it, and if you disagree, you better post a comment on my blog, and that's how we'll adjudicate academic disputes. The answer, by the way, to the question of whether this conversation needs to end there is no. And I, for one, am glad, though maybe different people feel differently. There are a variety of models that currently exist. There are some entire disciplines. If you take high energy physics, for example, there's something called the archive that archive with an X, I don't get it either, A-R-X-I-V, maybe the X is capital, I don't know. That was created at the University of California, Davis, many, many years ago, and has become a universal repository. All high energy physics articles get posted there when they're submitted for free and downloadable by all. And the journals just kept chugging along. People still submit them to the journals for peer review. The value to the academic community provided by the process of peer review is significant, and so the journals are still subscribed to by the libraries. But hey, the information is out there. That means that our friends growing up isolated in rural South India have access to it. And frankly, it means that, yes, as long as the prices are reasonable and affordable, the libraries continue to subscribe. But there's always that threat there, that even if we pull our subscription, we'll still be able to read this online, and maybe that provides a little bit of pressure as the prices are set in the marketplace. So this doesn't need to radically change the process of peer review or publication or what the academic and scholarly writing world looks like. But I think it's important to say that not as a, hey, don't worry about that happening. Hey, let's not feel like we need to grapple with questions of radical disruption created by these technologies. It's merely the statement that we can control that evolution. And that if we decide that other world where academic disputes are hashed out in comment threads on blogs instead of in refereed journals, then we can go there if we want to. And if we don't want that, we don't have to. And so I close with 3 stories, kind of a sandwich of stories. I have written down here a metaphor for what kind of sandwich it is. We will skip that. The first story occurred when I was teaching mathematics. I was teaching a kind of an advanced, sophisticated freshman course in analysis, and I loved it. But that's not the point of the story. I got all distracted. Sorry. Whatever. Doesn't matter. Maybe I hated it. You don't know. And a student of mine came to office hours, and it was the end of I should tell you, this was, I think, about 2004, 2005. Student comes to me for office hours, and it's just been a long day, and I'm not at my most coherent. We all have moments of more clarity and moments of less clarity. This was a moment of less clarity for me. And he asked me some pretty complicated question that I just kept stumbling over the answer, and I got frustrated with myself, and it's like, all right, hold on, let me just back up and try this again. I erased the blackboard, and I was about to start again, and he said to me, don't worry about it, I'll go home and look it up on Wikipedia. And I saw my own obsolescence. This is it. Like, what? Y'all don't need me anymore. And of course, here I am in the legislature, but that's not why. The second story is about my brother. My brother's a pianist. He's fortunate to be a successful performer, travels the world, plays concerts, and has recently begun teaching at the Curtis Institute of Music in Philadelphia. Curtis is a very small, very elite institution. It has, at any given time, around 150 students. In its history, it's had, I believe, 4,000 students. He was approached by something called Coursera, which is a MOOC. That's an embarrassing acronym. But it stands for Massive Open Online Course. He was approached by them and asked to put together a mini course, a series of 5 lectures on the Beethoven piano sonatas. He's embarked on a project to record all of them. He's writing all about them. They asked him to teach an online course. So he was like, all right, no one's going to care, but I'll do this. You asked, I'll do this. Remember, in the history of Curtis, a school where one of his colleagues is in her 90s and has been teaching since before Second World War, true fact. Faculty meetings are funny. In the history of the school, there have been 4,000 students. Jonathan has finished his Coursera course that had 30,000 students. He goes around the world to play a concert, and he says, I'm going to stop in the Starbucks across the street from the concert hall from 4 to 5 tomorrow to have office hours. People come in droves. They talk about the Beethoven piano sonatas. They argue about the second theme and the third movement. They talk about history. They talk about music theory. This is an opportunity for his institution and him to educate and communicate with people in a way that would have been just completely unthinkable. This isn't a marginal enhancement of what he was already doing. This is a radically different thing, and it is just straight up, unambiguously better for human knowledge on planet Earth and human engagement in beautiful, difficult, aesthetic activities on planet Earth. Which brings me to my third story. I was talking on the phone a month and a half ago with my dearest friend, college roommate, who's now a mathematics professor at UC Santa Cruz. And I started telling him story number 2 about my brother and the Coursera course. And I got as far as the word Coursera. And he said, Coursera. I can't know that he actually literally shook his fist to the sky, because notwithstanding modern technology, this wasn't a video chat, but I feel pretty confident. He said, Coursera has now gotten to our administration. I'm on a faculty committee that's supposed to deal with the question of how to respond to the Coursera incursion on our campus, and I know what they're trying to do. They're trying to turn this university into the McDonald's of higher education. And they're trying to set up a 2-tiered world where the truly elite students will still be able to go to Harvard, those who can afford it. And they'll have actual attention from actual professors, actual back and forth engagement with ideas, and they're going to move the rest of higher ed to watching stuff on TV and just hoping that you thought it through yourself on your spare time. They're going to do it to save money. They're going to do it to universalize the system, and it's going to wind up hurting the education of 98% of our kids in this country. And I mean, I told those stories on purpose, but there's not really a moral, except that all of this stuff is possible. And we have a tremendous amount of control over it. And we need to have a certain amount of flexibility and understand that there's tremendous dislocation and discomfort in these transitions. And I think we all need to acknowledge that if it were possible via free online web courses to provide Northern Illinois students the same education that you, the faculty, provide for them, that would be pretty bad for you, but pretty good for the world. But color me skeptical. Color me skeptical. The responsible way to handle these technological opportunities is to have a clear-eyed view of what the status quo is, to understand that it is problematic, but also that it has massive advantages, that we don't want to burn it to the ground, that it is not beneficial to mechanize and depersonalize all that we do, that humans talking to humans about deep ideas is kind of why we're alive. It's what you do here on a campus, and we should appreciate it and honor it and not try to technologize it away. But that we have an incredible opportunity at low cost and unbelievable scale to revolutionize the spread of human information, to grant opportunity across the globe, to bring down costs in a way that extends opportunity here at home. And if we do it thoughtfully, if those 9 task forces on those 9 different institutional platforms engage with this question, engage honestly with it, and chart a course toward the future we can build, there's an opportunity here to create a massive enhancement of quality of life on Earth. And actually, at the end of the day, that's why we're all here. Thank you very much. So politicians are liars, and I was asked if I would leave time for questions, and I said yes, and it's 3:32, and I'm sorry, but I have time. Are we allowed to do questions even though it's 3:32? Are there questions? Oh. Yes. The question was, when and how did open access first come to my attention? It came to my attention as an academic because, to be honest, the mathematics community is pretty organized on this topic. The mathematics community had a very effective community-wide boycott of Elsevier, the publisher. There's a lot of, the editors of the journal Topology, which is a journal that has meant a lot in my intellectual life, resigned en masse to protest the pricing policies of the journal and created a new competing journal, essentially shutting that old journal down, more or less. There's just a lot of chatter around this in the world of mathematics, probably mostly coincidentally, but also because math is at a funny cultural spot in academia. It's sort of like the sciences in some ways, but sort of like the humanities and social sciences in other ways. And so that leaves us, I think, kind of sensitive to cost in the way that the humanities are, but kind of participating in the publishing practices of the hard sciences. And so I lived this as I remember going to my advisor when I was publishing a paper and being like, hey, am I a grotesque monster if I publish this in an expensive journal? And he said, no. He said that at that point, in 2000 or 2001, he said he believed that the community was in a position where the leaders who had less to lose ought to be making that type of stance, and the starving graduate students who are trying to make a career for themselves could probably still just try to publish anywhere that would have them. But I thought about this just as a participant, let's say, in the marketplace back then. I grew an interest in engaging with it in a professional way as a legislator, frankly, as a result of the suicide of Aaron Swartz. And to those of you who don't know the story, Aaron was real prodigy. I call him Aaron. I did not know him. He was a friend of several friends of mine, but not someone I knew personally, who grew up in Highland Park, actually spent some time at North Shore Country Day School in my legislative district, though he didn't, I don't think, graduate. He tended not to graduate from schools, sort of like the story that I opened with. Was involved in the creation of Reddit and RSS. Was a real, as a adolescent, was extraordinarily accomplished prodigy in internet architecture. I think he would have said that he wasn't like an internet guy so much as a let's find ways to connect people and allow information to flow freely guy, so much so that actually he invented something that would have become Wikipedia if it hadn't been so early. It was sort of a year before the creation of Wikipedia, and there just wasn't enough traffic to make it really work. He then so went to Stanford and then wound up living various times in Cambridge, Mass. And New York, and maintained an interest in technology, but really shifted his focus more directly toward political activism around freedom of and access to information. He was he had his initial run-in with the law when he felt, I think obviously rightly, that it's crazy that the database of federal judicial decisions is not freely available, but rather you have to pay per page to download from. And I don't remember the details of that case, but downloaded giant numbers of cases, and I think there was had some interaction at least with law enforcement around it. But then did a lot of other things, was one of the top leaders in the movement to kill the really, really bad legislation in Washington around lack of internet freedom and net neutrality and so forth. But also got involved in a more sort of what one might call kind of civil disobedience activism around open access. There is, as most of you know, large database of academic articles called JSTOR, which almost all research institutions are subscribers to. And the MIT, I know this sounds like I'm bouncing around, but I'm getting there. The MIT wireless network is totally open. You can just walk onto campus in MIT with your laptop and log on. So he walked onto MIT campus with his laptop and logged on, and because they were subscribers of JSTOR, started downloading JSTOR articles. He eventually wrote a script to do it manually. JSTOR, who felt that this was a violation of copyright. It wasn't in an obvious way, but they felt that it was clear that he was going to then post these articles for free online, which may or may not be true. They cut off his IP address, and then he shifted IP addresses, and they cut off that IP address, and then he shifted again, and they cut off the entire MIT campus access to JSTOR, which turned out to be not a good idea. Anyway, he was eventually caught by a security camera in a closet in MIT, and the US Department of Justice with, I'm sad to say, MIT's collaboration, engaged in a very, very, very misguided prosecution, I should say investigation of him, that after a couple years, after a couple years, in January of 2013, he hung himself. It is the belief of his family and his close friends that this was a result of the despair that he experienced as a consequence of the investigation. As you can surely imagine, and maybe you can tell right now, I was pretty powerfully affected by this story. And he was an Illinois native. In fact, went to high school, hated it, but went to high school in my district. And here we are in the state of Illinois. As this open access movement is one way or another sweeping the globe, we were, I think, the largest state that didn't have a single institution that's voluntarily adopted an open access policy, and I thought that this was the appropriate way to memorialize him and to take action that would have been meaningful to him in response to the fate that he befell. So that's what led to me engaging with legislative action on this bill and eventually on this topic and eventually passing this bill. Other questions? Well, thank you very, very much for the invitation.